Hello, my friend. Today I will tell you another long-forgotten legend. Close your eyes and let the magic transport you to Middle-earth. Our journey begins. In the deep twilight of the Second Age, when the stars above Middle-earth burned steady and cold like ancient watchfires, and the rivers still remembered the songs of the firstborn, a shadow moved once more across the east. It was not the swift darkness of night, nor the passing sorrow of a cloudy moon, but a dread that crept from the land of Mordor like smoke that cannot be grasped. Like a whisper that will not leave the ear, the land trembled beneath it. The trees, even those rooted in memory far older than the world of men, shivered with the knowledge of its return. There were those who knew the signs, the wise, the watchers, those who remembered. The elves, long-lived and sorrowful, beheld the gathering dark and knew its name. The men of the West, Núm-Manarans in exile, still bore in their veins the blood of a proud island lost to the sea, and their hearts stirred with echoes of that ancient defiance. Sauron, the servant of Morgoth, had risen again, and his eye, though litless and without form, was fixed upon dominion. Not by armies alone, but by fear he sought to conquer. But there were still lights in the world. Hope, though weathered, had not perished. In the fair lands of Linen, Gil-galad, High King of the Elves of the West, stood tall beneath the golden leaves of autumn. And in the north, in the realm of Arnor, Elendil the Tall looked eastward with eyes like storm-laden skies. Elendil, son of the Lost Isle, father of kings. He had survived the downfall of Númenor and brought his people over the bending seas on white-sailed ships that bore no name for their grief. When the time came, they did not hesitate. For though Sauron's power waxed and his armies swelled with orcs and fell beasts, though his stronghold, Barad-dûr, rose again like a black wound in the land, the free peoples would not stand idle. A final alliance was called, not in haste, but in memory and purpose. From the forests of Lothlorien came elven warriors with hair like sunlit wheat and voices like the wind in leaves. From the stone cities of Gondor came soldiers in silver and sable, bearing the white tree upon their shields. From Imladras came Elrond, herald of Gil-galad, his face a quiet echo of both wisdom and sorrow. And from the scattered hills of Arnor rode men who had never seen the sea, but who bore within them the fire of Númenor still. They gathered in the valley of Imladras, where the river sang, and time folded gently around memory. There, beneath the stars that had watched over the first awakening of the elves, they swore their oath, not to conquer, not for vengeance, but to preserve, to defend what still remained of beauty and freedom in Middle-earth. It was not the promise of victory that bound them, but the refusal to yield to despair. Elendil stood beside Gil-galad, tall and silent as stone, his sword Narsil at his side, its edge reflecting the starlight. "We cannot know what awaits us," he said, his voice like the low wind before a storm. "But we know what must be done." Gil-galad nodded, his gaze distant. "The shadow is a wound upon Arda. It must be burned away, though the fire take us also." And so they marched. The host moved eastward, slow and solemn. Banners of silver and gold, of white trees and stars, fluttered against the sullen sky. They passed through lands once green, now scorched and emptied. In the distance, the black gate of Mordor loomed, a M through which war would soon pour. But the alliance did not falter. On the plains of Dagorlad they made their stand. It was a gray land, wide and bitter, where the grass grew in patches and the wind spoke of ancient grief. Here, beneath skies that no longer welcomed the sun, the War of the Last Alliance began, and from Mordor, Sauron answered. His armies spilled forth legions of orcs with eyes like coals, trolls with skin like mountains, and darker things born of fire and shadow, whose names were lost even to elves. The clash was terrible. For days without end the field thundered with a ring of steel and the cries of the dying. The elves moved like light upon water, swift and sure, their arrows falling like stars. The men of Numor held their ranks like iron walls, unyielding even as their brothers fell. Elendil fought at the front, his sword rising and falling like a beacon in the storm. And beside him, Isildur and Anárion, his sons, gave their strength to the cause with fierce, unrelenting courage. And Mordor answered with fire. Flames leapt from the ground. Creatures of ruin clawed their way from the ash. But the alliance pressed forward. Inch by inch, mile by mile, they drove the enemy back, until at last they came to the foot of the Dark Tower, Barad-dûr. It rose like a wound against the sky, a fortress of smoke and malice. Its peak crowned with thunder, and its foundations sunk into despair. Here the siege began. 7 years they stood before it, the alliance of elves and men enduring every torment the Dark Lord could devise. Famine and pestilence, nightmares that stalked the living, spells that twisted the very air. But still they stood. In the deep chambers of the tower, Sauron brooded. He who had once worn fair form now cloaked himself in terror. He forged weapons of dread, sent forth emissaries of shadow, but he did not emerge, not yet. In the camp of the Alliance, time slowed. Days passed like seasons. The dead were buried with songs that grew quieter each time. Yet hope endured, faint but unbroken. And among the watchfires Elend walked, his gaze ever turned to the east, where a final reckoning waited like the hush before a storm. The land before Barad-dûr lay in a mournful silence, as if even the breath of wind dared not speak in the presence of such ancient evil. The sky was a lid of dull iron pressing down on the plain with a weight that made even the strongest hearts weary. The very air tasted of ash and memory of things long dead and never buried. The earth beneath the feet of the Alliance was blackened and cracked, its veins running deep with old fire, as though the mountain itself bled slowly, endlessly, from wounds it had suffered in ages beyond recall. And above it all, the tower loomed, not merely a structure of stone, but a symbol, a monument to domination, a will made visible. It rose not with grace, but with hunger, a jagged spire of despair that seemed to lean toward the watchers below, as though it would fall and crush them for their defiance. Within the shadow of that fortress, the Alliance endured. Their camp was a small flicker of light beneath the smothering sky, a fragile defiance against the overwhelming dark. Fires burned low, guarded jealously, not only for warmth, but for the small comfort they gave. The illusion, perhaps, that the world still turned, that the stars might one day be seen again through the ever-choking smoke. The tents of men and elves stood side by side, their banners tattered but upright, their watchmen silent but unblinking, between those of the firstborn and the younger race of men. A quiet bond had grown, not one of loud camaraderie, but of shared sorrow, the kind that needs no words. It was on one such dusk, when the sky wept soot instead of rain, and the mountains glowed with a sullen red, that Elend came again to the tent of Elendil. The High King of Arnor sat alone, his great helm resting beside him, his hand wrapped around a vessel of cool water drawn from the stream that barely trickled through the plain. A stream the elves had found, hidden beneath rocks and ruin, and coaxed to the surface again with songs so soft they were mistaken for wind. Gil-galad walks beneath the stars, though there are none, Elrond said as he entered, his voice a low murmur, as though speaking too loudly would bring the wrath of the mountain. He says he listens for them still, that they speak to those who have not forgotten their voices. Elendil looked up, his eyes darkened by weariness, but lit with the embers of thought. Then I envy him, for I have forgotten the stars. I remember their pattern, their stories, but not their light. When I try to recall them, it is as if I am reading from a book whose pages have all turned blank. Tell me, Master Elend, do the stars grow fainter when evil waxes strong, or do we merely lose the eyes to see them? Elrond stood silent for a moment, letting the question hang in the air like smoke that refused to rise. Then he stepped forward and knelt by the brazier, feeding it a twist of dry root that flared briefly in golden blue. "Perhaps both," he answered at last, his eyes catching the reflection of the flame. "The Valar speak of sight as a mirror, not a lantern. We see by the light we carry within. And yet even the brightest mirror is clouded by shadow when the source of the shadow stands close enough." Elendil considered that in silence. Then after a long breath he leaned back in his chair, his great shoulders sinking as if the weight of the world lay upon them. "We have stood here 7 years," he said, and his voice bore the weight of each one. 7 winters beneath a sunless sky, 7 springs where nothing blooms, 7 summers of dry air that cracks the lips and sears the soul. And still he does not come. He sends his beasts, his plague, his fires, but he does not come. I do not believe he will until we are broken first. "Sauron waits," Elrond said, and his words carried the cold of ancient snow. "He watches through eyes not his own, through winds that speak to him, through whispers that pass between walls of stone. He listens for our fear, for the creak of faltering resolve. He knows that time is a weapon. Not every sword strikes in a single blow." Elendil turned to him, his face suddenly fierce with a quiet passion that surged like a river beneath ice. "Then we must teach him that we are not stone, nor flame, nor iron. We are oath and memory. We are what remains when all else is lost. If we do not hold now, then there will be no dawn for any who follow." Outside a wind stirred, soft at first, but rising, tugging at the flaps of the tent, wailing low and long like a child crying in a sleep it cannot wake from. The brazier's flame shivered, casting long shadows across the canvas walls. And in those shadows, the 2 figures seemed as statues, one young and bright-eyed, the other old and grave, both carved by the same sculptor. "Sorrow," Elrond spoke, but his words were barely louder than the whisper of fire. "I have walked through the ruins of Boliriond. I have seen cities drowned and mountains shattered. I have heard the silence of those who never came back. This war, it is the echo of the first war, the shadow of all that came before. And yet in all that loss I have not despaired, not truly, until now." Elendil turned, not in anger, but with the sudden gentleness of one who has known despair, and wrestled it long enough to wear it like a second cloak. "Then hold to me," he said, and placed a hand on Elrond's shoulder, firm as a tower set upon a hill. "If your hope dims, let mine bear its burden. And if mine should fail, then let us walk together in the dark until the dawn finds us or forgets us." Elrond closed his eyes, and for a moment the brayer flickered lower, then flared again. A wind from the east side sighed against the tent walls, as though even the land had heard and drawn a breath. Outside, Gil-galad stood upon a small rise of stone alone, his cloak streaming like a banner in the windless air. His gaze was turned upward to the ash-choked sky, and though no stars shone, he began to sing, not in defiance, but in remembrance. It was a song of starlight on the waters of Cuvian, of the first sight of trees crowned in silver and gold, of light that knew no shadow. The notes were thin, fragile, almost lost in the void, but they wrote, and in the hearts of those who heard, something stirred, a memory, a promise. Not that they would win, but that it was still worth standing, still worth hoping, still worth singing into the silence. Thus the long night deepened, but did not conquer. The years that followed were measured not in days or months, but in the slow shifting of silence, in the weathering of faces, and the deepening of lines around eyes that had seen too much and not enough. The siege wore on like the grinding of stones beneath a glacier, inexorable and without mercy. And all who endured it came to understand that this war was not only one of steel and fire, but of the soul, where the greatest battles were fought not with sword or spear, but in the quiet spaces between battles, when memory crept like mist and doubt settled like frost upon the heart. Within the ring of tents that dotted the bleak field before Barad-dûr, life had settled into a rhythm so subdued, so haunted, that it felt less like living and more like an echo of it. Elves moved through the camp with the grace of dancers who had long forgotten their music, while the men, grim and weary, wrapped themselves in the cloak of duty, their voices low, their laughter all but vanished, replaced by the weight of waiting and the knowledge that any day might be the one that ended them. There was, however, one fire that still burned with unrelenting heat, even if it did not blaze as brightly as before, and it dwelled in Isildur, son of Elendil, a man carved not of marble or myth, but of sorrow and steel, whose heart beat with the fervor of his ancestors, and whose eyes held the storm-tossed light of the sea that had swallowed Numor. One evening, as the sky bled rust and smoke, and the clouds over Oridren pulsed with a dark fire that did not die, Isildur walked the perimeter of the camp, his boots stirring the dust that had lain undisturbed for centuries. He was alone, though he knew that Elendil and Gil-galad had noted his restlessness, and that they would speak to him again in time. But for now he needed solitude, not counsel. The wind that blew from the east was warm, but it carried no life, only the scent of sulfur and cinders, as though the land itself exhaled its pain. He paused by a dead tree, its limbs twisted like the hands of a man reaching for salvation that never came, and placed a hand upon its bark, feeling the brittle texture, the hollowness within. It reminded him, oddly, of the halls of Armenel before the fall, majestic on the surface, but beneath riddled with pride and rot. Behind him, soft footsteps crunched against the gravel. He did not turn, but he knew the sound. "Elend," he said, his voice low, half a whisper, half a challenge. "You follow like the wind, never seen, but always felt." Elend approached and stood beside him in the dying light. His face as still as the surface of a deep lake, but his eyes glimmered with unspoken thought. "You walk as though the land might speak to you, Isildur," he said quietly, "as though its wounds might offer some answer we have missed." Isildur did not respond at once. He stood with his hand still pressed to the lifeless bark, then finally drew away and stared into the distance, where the red glow of Mount Doom flickered like the eye of some beast that dreamed of blood. "I wonder," he said after a silence so long it might have been mistaken for reluctance, "I wonder if the land remembers what it once was before the shadow took root. Before we too came with our banners and our swords and our noble cause. Does it know the difference between the footsteps of tyrants and those of kings? Or is it all simply wait to be endured until the mountain swallows us all?" Aaron's brow furrowed slightly, and he glanced toward the tower that loomed ever near, a jagged fang set against the broken sky. "The land bears witness," he said, his voice quiet but sure. "It does not judge as we do. It endures. It remembers. The rivers may forget the names of their shores, but the stones, they carry the echoes of every voice that is cried out in anguish or in hope. And I believe, I must believe, that somewhere that memory matters." A silver laughed, a sound not harsh but hollow like wind blowing through a ruined hall. "Hope. Yes, we speak of it often as though naming it might make it real. But I have seen what hope becomes when the hunger grows too strong. I saw it in numb manner when our people, blessed above all, turned from the grace of the West and grasped at shadows thinking they could steal eternity. And now here we stand beneath the gaze of another deceiver, another god in all but name, and we speak of hope once more." He turned fully now, facing Elrond, his eyes hard but not unkind. "Tell me honestly, do you not fear that even should we win, even should Sauron fall, we will simply rise to take his place? That power once touched leaves a stain that never fades." Elend was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was barely more than the wind itself. "I do fear it," he admitted, "because I have seen it before, not only in men, but in my own kind. There is a shadow that lies not only in Mordor, but within us. We are mirrors, Ishild, every one of us. And the longer we look into the dark, the more we risk becoming its reflection." The two stood in silence. Then, as the wind picked up, swirling ash around their boots, carrying it across the camp like snow in a world where winter never ended. Far off, a horn sounded, distant, mournful, the call of a scout returning, or perhaps a warning, but neither moved. Finally, Isolde turned back to the tree, its limbs creaking in the breeze. "I dream of water," he said, almost to himself, "of white sails and silver shores, of a land where my children might live without swords in their hands. I dream, and then I wake here in this ruin, in this memory of the world." Elend stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. Not as a lord to a warrior, but as one soul to another. "Then let that dream be your light," he said. "Let it be your star. We must hold on to our dreams, Isildur, for the darkness cannot dream. It only consumes." And for a moment, just a moment, Isildur looked again toward the mountain. And though his jaw was tight and his eyes shadowed, there was a flicker within them, small but steady, a glimmer like the edge of dawn, barely rising beyond the rim of the world. The mountain rumbled. It was a deep, unsettling sound. Not loud, not thunderous, but rather like the slow cracking of some ancient shell beneath the skin of the world. A reminder that the heart of this land was not dead, but slumbering, and in its dreams it burned. Orodruin, the mountain of fire, stood not simply as a monument to destruction, but as a breathing, brooding presence, its voice thick with molten wrath, its voice like the groaning of a giant in chain. The skies above it had long forgotten the blue of peace. They churned instead with smoke and bruised light, a ceaseless conflict of storm and soot where no bird dared fly and no sun had shone in many seasons. The light that fell upon the plain was not light at all, but a kind of weary glow, sallow and lifeless, as if the sun itself were ashamed to gaze upon this place. The siege had entered its 7th year. In the minds of many, the number 7 was sacred, symbol of completion, of divine order, of fateful culmination. But here in this place where hope came to die, the number felt more like a curse, as if the passage of time itself mocked the alliance, turning their resolve to dust, their memories to ghosts, and their strength to brittle glass. Within the camp, quiet had settled like a snowfall that no season could melt. The clang-anger of battle was far behind them, and ahead only the tower still unbroken. There were no more charges, no great victories, only endurance. The long, silent war of attrition between will and despair. Men sharpened swords they no longer expected to raise. Elves tended to wounded who did not speak. And among them the oldest hearts began to falter, not with noise, but with a sigh, with a silence that grew too comfortable. On such a night, when the wind blew dry and bitter from the mountain's flanks, and the stars remained hidden behind a ceiling of grief, Anárion sat with his father beneath the banner of the white tree. The cloth had once been brilliant, woven with threads of mithril and moonlight, but now it hung torn and faded, its edges singed, its symbol dimmed but not erased. Elendil, his hands clasped loosely upon the hilt of Narsil, stared long into the fire before them. The flames danced with little joy, throwing shadows across his face, etching new lines beside the old, like scars written by time instead of blade. He had spoken little in recent weeks, choosing instead to let silence be his language. A silence not of retreat, but of contemplation, like the quiet of a stone that endures all storms by simply being what it is. Anárion broke the silence first, his voice quiet, hesitant like one placing a hand upon water, unsure whether it will ripple or shatter. "Father," he said, "I do not dream anymore." Elendil did not look up, but his brow moved slightly, as if a distant thought had stirred. "I used to," Anárion continued. "When we first crossed the sea, my dreams were full of stars, of ships that sailed unbroken into morning, of Numor, as it was, shining and unyielding. Even here, in the first years of this war, I dreamed of towers rebuilt, of peace not merely won, but understood. But now there is only the mountain and the shadow beneath it. I close my eyes and see nothing else. It follows me even in sleep." Elendil's voice came slowly, like water drawn from a deep well. "Do you know? He said that in the days of our ancestors, the greatest punishment was not death, but forgetting. To be unremembered, to vanish from the hearts of the living, that was the truest doom. They believed that memory was a fire that kept the soul warm beyond the world. I think perhaps dreams are part of that fire. Anárion turned toward him, the firelight catching in his eyes. Then what are we if the fire goes out? For a long time Elendil said nothing. He sat very still, his gaze fixed upon the embers as though trying to read a truth written in ash. When he spoke again, his voice was softer but no less firm. Then we must become the fire. He looked at his son at last, his expression not fierce but full of sorrow and steel, like a sword that had been tempered not once, but again and again until it knew its own purpose, not by edge, but by endurance. We are the keepers of the flame, Anárion. Not the light, no, for that belongs to Au and to the stars. But we are the ones who guard it, who carry it through shadow, who shield it with our bodies when the wind howls too loud. If we stop dreaming, it is not because the dreams are false. It is because the burden of holding them is too great. But we must hold them still. The wind sighed through the camp, rustling the canvas, stirring the ashes. And far above, the clouds shifted just enough to reveal a single star, pale and distant, like a tear frozen on the cheek of the sky. Anárion followed his father's gaze, and for a moment the silence between them felt full, not empty. Later that night, when most had taken to their tents, Gil-galad walked alone along the outer ridge, his robes trailing behind him like the wake of a ship crossing a black sea. His steps were deliberate, measured, not from weariness, but from the gravity of foresight. He had seen many wars, borne many losses, and though his face remained unmarred by time, his soul was a forest scorched by many fires, where new growth came only slowly, and every tree remembered its falling. Elrond joined him, unbidden, as he always did. They did not speak at first, but moved together like twin stars in an ancient sky, bound by the same orbit of duty and sorrow. At length, Gil-galad spoke, and his voice was like a harp string plucked in a storm, gentle but resonant. Do you feel it, Elend? The tide. It shifts. Elrond nodded, his gaze fixed on the black spire in the distance. It rises, and the shore draws near. Too near, said the High King, stopping. We cannot hold the line much longer. The hearts of men waver. Even the elves grow dim in this place. The mountain feeds on hope. Elrond turned toward him, his face illuminated by the flicker of starlight and memory. And yet we remain. Gil-galad smiled faintly, though the expression did not reach his eyes. For how long? As long as we must. They stood together on that bleak hill, watching the world turn, not with joy, but with quiet resolve. The land below groaned in its long agony, but still they held fast, like stones placed by a hand long gone, carved to endure, not to win. And deep within Barad-dûr, Sauron stirred. He had watched, he had waited, but now he would rise. It began with a silence that was not silence, a stillness so profound that even the wind seemed to hold their breath, a tension in the air that set every blade of dry grass trembling, every tent flap shivering as if the earth itself awaited a sound that had not yet been born. The fires in the camp dimmed inexplicably, not extinguished, but muted, as though the light feared to draw attention to itself. Horses stirred uneasily, stamping the scorched soil, their breath visible though the air was warm, and the watchers on the outer ramparts looked eastward with unease, mounting behind their eyes like storm clouds gathering behind the mountains. And then at last the tower sang. It was not a song in the way the elves understood music, nor was it a cry in the tongue of men. It was a resonance, a note struck from the deepest chord of despair itself. A vibration that passed not only through the ground, but through the bones, through the heart, through the very marrow of those who heard it. Barad-dûr, ancient and abhorrent, alive in a way no structure should be, pulsed with power, its stones groaning and flexing as if the tower drew breath, and from its summit, shrouded in shadow, wreathed in storms that wept fire instead of rain. Sauron stepped forth, not as he once was, fair of form and subtle in his deceits when he had beguiled kings and whispered into the minds of proud hearts, but terrible and unhidden, a figure forged of darkness and fire, cloaked in the remnants of stolen glory, a mockery of a king. His presence was an absence, a void that consumed light and hope in equal measure. And where he walked, the very air recoiled, curling away as if to flee the touch of a will so immense, so ancient, that it had forgotten mercy. From the camps of the Alliance, a trumpet sounded, not as a call to war, but as a defiant breath, a sound that dared to rise into the face of despair. Elendil heard it from his command tent, and he stood slowly as though waking from a long dream. His eyes, which had looked upon the downfall of Numor, upon the ruin of lands more fair than any now left in Middle-earth, narrowed not in fear, but in understanding. He stepped outside into the wind, and the night seemed to part for him, not with reverence, but with acknowledgement. Here was a man marked by fate, whose footsteps had long echoed with the sounds of doom, and yet who had not turned from the path. Behind him came Anárion, neither speaking, for what words could there be at such a moment? The war had stretched them all, had hollowed them, but left within that hollow space something strange and unbreakable. Resolve not born of confidence, but of necessity. Elrond came to them swiftly, his face lit not by firelight, but by some inner flame, some reflection of Valinor that still lingered behind his gaze. "He comes," he said, and his voice did not tremble, though the very earth did. At last he steps into the open. The game is cast. We must meet him, or all is lost before the sun can rise again. Elendil nodded, his hand falling to the hilt of Narsil, with a weight that was not merely martial, but ceremonial, a gesture bound in oath and inheritance. "Then let us go to him," he said. "Let the end come, or the beginning be born." They rode not in silence, but in solemnity, a company of the greatest lords of Middle-earth, moving through the camp like the last leaves of autumn, carried by a wind that knew winter was near. The men watched them pass and did not cheer, for this was not a march of glory, but of reckoning. The elves sang no songs, but bowed their heads, their voices hushed with the weight of memory and mourning. Even the stars above, long hidden, seemed to peer through the smoke, distant and faint, as if unsure whether they should bear witness. And before the black gate, beneath the looming tower that watched with lidless malice, they found him waiting. Sauron, he stood alone, yet his presence filled the plain. A figure wrought of darkness more than flesh, his armor a shifting mirage of metal and flame, shaped like the ruins of the world's first fire. No eyes were visible beneath his helm, yet all felt his gaze, probing, peeling understanding. And when he spoke, it was not with voice, but with will. His words entering the mind like heat into a wound impossible to ignore, and deeply, deeply wrong. Elendil, came the thought, echoing across the plain like a toll. Son of the fallen isle, you stand again before a power you cannot comprehend. Have you learned nothing from your ruin? Elendil's voice, when it came, was steady and clear, like a river that has cut through stone for centuries. I have learned that power without love is a lie, and that kings who would rule by fear do not build, but only... Sauron laughed then, and it was a sound that cracked the ground. Love. Is that what you have brought me? A final offering of sentiment and dust. You think yourselves champions of the light, but you are only embers flickering in a wind you cannot command. Bow to me, and I will spare what remains of your line. Isolde stepped forward then, his eyes flashing not with arrogance, but with something quieter, deeper, an inherited sorrow sharpened into resolve. You mistake endurance for weakness, he said. You mistake silence for surrender. But we have walked through fire. We have borne the ruin of our world, and still we come. Not to beg, not to kneel, but to end this. And from Gil-galad came the final voice, soft as silver rain on ancient leaves, yet more cutting than any blade. You were once among us, Sauron. You knew the music of the stars. How low you have fallen to twist that song into chains. Sauron raised his hand, and the sky above seemed to scream, lightning flashing from cloud to cloud, illuminating his form in brief, terrible glimpses. "Then come," he said, though no word passed his lips. "Come and test your light against the last of the dark. Let the world break upon..." And the battle began, not with a charge, not with a cry, but with a meeting of wills so fierce that the very world seemed to bend. Elendil and Gil-galad, side by side, blades drawn, stepped into shadow. They did not look back. The clash was not like other battles, for it was not merely fought with weapons or bodies or strategies wrought by clever captains. It was an unraveling, a collision of truths so ancient that the sky itself seemed to shudder, as if remembering a time when the world was not yet shaped, and all things lived only as songs in the mind of the darkness that surged from bearer was not merely the shadow of evil, but the memory of it, the concentrated hate of an age that had never been healed. And it moved not with speed, but with certainty, like a tide rising not to destroy, but to claim. And Elendil, tall and terrible in his sorrow, strode into it with the grace of one who has nothing more to lose, only oaths left to fulfill. Beside him, Gil-galad shone not with joy, but with the kind of light that comes after morning, the glow of a star seen through mist, beautiful but unreachable. Together they advanced, not toward glory, for that had long since burned away, but toward something quieter, heavier, the burden of finality. Their swords gleamed in the half-light, catching what remained of the world's color-like vessels, desperate to preserve even the smallest sliver of what was beautiful before it was devoured. Around them, the armies had erupted into chaos, but not disorder. It was a fury too precise, too desperate to be called disarray. Elves and men fought not with the certainty of victory, but with the clarity of necessity. The enemy was endless. An ocean of orcs and monstrous shapes, of fell spirits clothed in broken forms, of fire and ash and ancient rage. And yet the alliance held because they must, because there was no other road left to walk. Within the eye of this storm, the duel unfolded, not quick, not clean, but like the slow grinding of mountains against one another. Gil-galad and Elendil struck at Sauron, not only with blades, but with the full weight of all they had borne, the grief of immortal memory and the defiance of mortal loss. Their weapons flashed like lightning, not bright, but blinding in the gloom, and where they struck, even the darkness recoiled. But Sauron was not merely a foe. He was a storm wrapped in shape, a tempest of will hardened into wrath, and every blow he returned rang not only through flesh, but through the soul. Time in that moment forgot itself. To those who watched, and there were many, though none could approach, the battle seemed to stretch and condense, each moment a lifetime, each heartbeat a universe. Elrond stood among the captains, his eyes wide, not with fear, but with the weight of understanding, for he knew what was being asked of his king, and he knew deep in the marrow of his spirit that the price would be exacted in full, and he could do nothing but bear witness. Sauron's voice, when it came, was not spoken but felt pressed into the minds of those nearby, like a brand seared into thought. "You are dust," it hissed. "You are a flicker in the wind. You are the memory of a flame that once dared to dance before the night." And Elendil, bleeding from a dozen wounds, his armor cracked, his breath ragged, raised Narsil high, and answered not with rhetoric, but with the gravity of his being. "We are the spark that returns to the fire. We are the silence that survives the scream. We are the pain that remembers love. It cannot break us, for we were broken long before, and still we rise." And then Gil-galad struck. It was not a blow meant for victory, but for meaning. His spear, Alo, pierced through Sauron's armor and into whatever lay beneath, spirit or substance, darkness or despair. And the scream that followed was not heard with ears, but felt through the bones of the earth. It was not pain. It was rejection. A god cast out, a power denied, and it cost him everything. Gil-galad fell, his body folding like a leaf in fire. And yet his eyes, as they dimmed, did not close. They stared upward, not at Sauron, not at the mountain, but at the sky, as if even then he searched for the stars he had loved so well. Elendil cried out, not in anguish, but in wrath, not the rage of hatred, but the rage of love betrayed, of a world ravaged again and again by the same ruinous hunger. He brought Narsil down not once, but thrice, and the blade, ancient and noble, shattered in his hand as it struck the final blow. Sauron staggered, not slain, for he could not be slain in such a way, but unbodied, cast out, his form collapsing in upon itself like a flame robbed of air. The great helm fell, the black gauntlets crumbled, the shadow coiled, then fled, not with speed, but with finality, leaving behind only the ring. It lay where Sauron had fallen, gleaming with an innocence it did not deserve. It was small, so terribly small, too small to bear the weight of the world, and yet it had a circle of gold, unmarred, unbroken, and utterly wrong. Elend lay beside it, motionless, and it was Isildur who ran to him, stumbling over rock and ruin, his cry tearing through the air. "Father!" He fell to his knees, cradling the body of the man who had led them through fire and flood, who had crossed a broken sea, not to escape death, but to meet it on his own terms. Elendil was still, his face peaceful, his hands open as if in release, and beside him in the dust, Narsil's shards gleamed like fallen stars. Elrond reached them moments later, his own heart aching with 1,000 unspoken things, his hand falling upon Isildur's shoulder. But Isildur did not weep. His eyes, though brimming, were fixed upon the ring. "This is his," he said, his voice quiet as if afraid to wake something. "This is his strength, his soul, his will." "It should be destroyed." Elend nodded. "Yes," he said, "it is bound to him. As long as it remains, he is not gone. We must take it to the fire." Isildur held it up, and in the strange dim light of Mordor it caught a glimmer, not bright but subtle, a whisper of power, a hint of things promised. And Isildur hesitated. The silence that followed the fall of Sauron was not relief, not the kind of silence that comes when danger is past, nor the quiet joy of a storm finally spent. It was a deeper, older kind of stillness, the kind that clings to the hollows left by greatness lost and wounds not yet healed. A silence filled not with peace, but with questions. The battlefield, once thunderous with steel and fire, now lay still beneath a bruised sky. And even the mountain, or a Druin whose fury had lit the heavens with crimson and smoke, seemed to draw in its breath, as though uncertain of what the world would become without the will that had once stirred its veins. Isildur stood at the heart of that silence, alone, though surrounded by the fallen. And before him the ring gleamed like a fallen tear that did not dry. A perfect circle nestled among the ash and broken stone. It shone with no light of its own, and yet it caught every flicker, every glint of dying firelight and fading sun, as if it hoarded brightness, claimed it, turned it inward. He stared down at it, his hand still extended, the golden band resting lightly in his palm, as if it had always known it would end here, as if it had waited through war and ruin to come to this hand. This moment, this choice, was beside him, though even he, wise beyond reckoning, seemed unsure how to speak. His breath rose slow in the cooling air, and he looked not at the ring, but at Tur, as though he knew that no word could touch the metal, but that perhaps a voice could still reach the man. "You know what it is," Elrond said at last, and his voice was not commanding, but pleading, quiet, weary, filled with the ache of a long burden borne too long. "You know it is not gold, but shadow. You know it is not a treasure, but a wound, one that bleeds not outward, but inward into the soul of whoever dares to claim it." Isildur did not answer at once. His gaze remained fixed on the ring, and the wind, soft and smoky, brushed against his hair and the hem of his cloak-like fingers, trying to pull him away or draw him closer. He could not tell. The battlefield stretched out behind him, littered with the broken shapes of friend and foe alike, and the mountain, distant but ever-present, loomed like a conscience-given form. "I know," Isildur said at last, his voice roughened by more than grief. "I know what it is. I feel it. Even now it speaks to me, not with words, not like Sauron's voice, not so crass, but with something deeper. It is like a mirror that does not show you your face, but the face you wish you had. It shows you what you could be, what you almost were, if only. He trailed off, and Elrond stepped closer, though his voice remained soft. "If only what?" "If only I had been stronger," Is said. And now he looked at Elend, his eyes bright with a terrible kind of clarity. "If only I had been wiser. If only the world had not broken again and again before my feet." "It whispers to me of healing, Elend, not conquest. It promises restoration, to make right what has been torn, to give meaning to sacrifice, to bind the wounds of a world too long sundered. Is that not what we have fought for?" Elrond's hand trembled, but not with fear. "No, that is the lie. It does not heal. It only holds. It freezes. It traps. It does not mend the broken thing. It makes the brokenness into a monument and then forces all the world to worship it. That is not peace. That is stasis. That is death without the dignity of silence." Isildur looked down again, his fingers closing slightly around the ring. "I have lost everything," he whispered. "My brother's blood still stains my hands. My father lies broken beside me, and his sword, his blade that was meant to preserve all that we are, lies in pieces. We have won, and I feel only emptiness." Elrond stepped forward, his voice fierce now, not in anger, but in compassion sharpened by sorrow. "Then cast it away into the fire. Let it go, Isildur. You do not need to carry this. You have borne enough. Let the world be free of this last chain. Let the mountain cleanse what no sword can." The ring seemed to gleam brighter as though hearing these words, as though protesting, and Isold's grip tightened. "You do not understand," he said, and his voice was different now, lower, touched with something perilous, though not yet fallen. "It came to me. I did not seek it. It is a token, a legacy, a sign that I have endured what others could not. If I cast it away, what remains? What proof do I have that this war, this agony, this ruin meant something?" Elrond shook his head, his expression stricken. "Meaning does not live in things, it lives in choices, in love given, and grief born in the quiet refusal to become what the darkness demands. Meaning is not kept, it is lived." Isildur turned from him, and the mountain, ever watching, sighed once more. A breeze rose from the crater's edge, hot and thick, filled with the breath of the earth's molten heart. The air shimmered with the scent of smoke and stone and secrets older than language. The cracks in the mountain glowed red and gold, veins of liquid fire pulsing with the memory of creation and the threat of unmaking. It waited, not with hunger, but with terrible patience. The ring lay in his sealer's hand, and he made his choice. "I will keep it," he said, and though his tone was soft, it carried the weight of a sentence passed. "It is mine. It came to me in the hour of my triumph, and I will not cast it aside. Not for fear, not for duty, not even for love." Elrond stepped back as if struck. And somewhere far away, though none heard it, then the world shuddered. The days that followed did not feel like days, but like the hollow echo of time stretched thin and trembling over the remnants of a world that had held its breath too long and now did not know how to exhale. The battlefield was cleared in solemn silence, the fallen borne on litters of linen and memory, their names whispered into the smoke-laced wind, committed not only to history, but to mourning. A mourning that had no song, no end, only the quiet grief of those who lived on. And in the center of it all, beneath the shadow of a mountain that had ceased its fire but not its gaze, remained, crowned by blood and silence alike. He bore the ring not openly, but it was never hidden, no more than a wound concealed beneath the bandage. Those around him did not speak of it, not out of ignorance, but from the strange instinctive caution that arises when one stands too near a cliff's edge or hears a child crying in a forest without a source. The ring had a weight that could not be measured, a gravity not felt by the flesh, but by the soul. And wherever Isildur walked, it walked with him, not behind nor beside, but within. The shards of Narsil were laid reverently in a casket of stone and silver, and Elend, though still silent from the wound of Isolde's choice, stood at the ceremony with a stillness more profound than stone. His hands folded before him, his eyes fixed not on the broken blade, but on the man who had once held it. Later, when the tents were struck and the armies turned westward, stood upon a ridge and looked back toward Mordor, toward the tower that lay broken and the mountain that still breathed its sullen sighs, he said nothing for a long time, not even to his kin, though they waited near. His brother's son, his soldiers, his captains. He only stared, and the land seemed to stare back, as if judging his silence and finding it too loud. When he finally spoke, it was to Elend, who had come to stand beside him, though he had not been summoned. "It should feel like an ending," Isildur said, his voice low, almost thoughtful, the way a man speaks to the sea. All this death, this ruin, the darkness torn down, it should feel like a door closed, a wound sealed. But it does not. It feels unfinished, like a story told in haste, or a song that forgot its final verse. Elrond's eyes did not waver because it is unfinished, because you have not ended it. Isildur turned then, slowly, his gaze searching, not defensive, but wounded. "You think I am blind to the weight of what I've done. You think I hold this ring as a prize, a treasure to be hoarded in secret, like some dragon in the old tales. But you are wrong, Elend. I know its nature. I feel its hunger. Every moment it rests against my chest, I feel it whispering, not with words, not even with thoughts, but with images, with desires not quite my own. It does not speak of power, not to me. It speaks of healing, of rebuilding, of all the things we have lost made new. Tell me, who among us could not be tempted by such hope?" The elf's face softened, though his sorrow remained etched in every line. "Hope," he said, "is the cruelest of lies when offered by those who never mean to give it. The ring does not offer hope, only longing. It does not build, it binds. It twists the wish until the wisher cannot tell if what he desires is light or only a different kind of shadow." Isildur breathed deeply, his fingers brushing the chain around his neck beneath the folds of his cloak. "And yet I cannot cast it away, not now, not yet. You speak as though the fire were the end of it, but I I wonder if that is too simple, too quick. The pain this ring has caused is vast, yes, but so too is the power it contains. Would it not be the greater justice to master it, to bend it to good, to shape it into something new, something that repairs instead of destroys? Elrond's gaze grew sharper, not in cruelty, but in piercing compassion. "Isildur," he said gently, "do you hear yourself? These are not your thoughts, not entirely. The ring does not demand worship. It offers agreement. It waits until your voice is joined with its own, until you cannot tell which was first. You say you want to heal, to restore, but the act of dominion, even in the name of peace, is still dominion, and once taken up, it cannot be put down." The wind picked up then, and the land seemed to stir once more. The brittle grass shifting like breath across a sleeping body, the dust of the plain rising briefly in the slanting light of a sun too tired to shine. Isolde looked out across it all, and for a moment he said nothing. When he spoke again, it was not to Elend, but to the world itself. "My father believed that the will of men could stand against anything, that though we are mortal, though we falter and fail, our strength lies in rising again, in shaping our own fate. He did not kneel to the valor, he did not bow to fear. He stood even as his world drowned. And I will not be less." He turned back to Elend, his eyes fierce and sad. Like a man who has chosen the path he knows leads through fire, but cannot yet bear to leave it. "I will keep it for now. I will guard it. I will study it. And when the time is right, when my line is secured, when peace is truly ours, then perhaps it can be unmade. But not now, not here, not yet." Elrond did not argue. He did not plead. He only looked at him long and deep, as one might look at a tree in autumn and wonder how much longer it will hold its leaves. And then he turned and walked away. Behind them, the mountainside once more as if disappointed, and above the sky remained clouded, though for a brief moment a single beam of light pierced the gloom. Not bright enough to change the world, but enough to cast a shadow. The ring beneath Isildur's cloak lay warm against his heart. The road northward wound like a pale scar through the blackened wilderness of the east. A thin ribbon of movement winding its way out of a land that did not forget and did not forget. The survivors of the War of the Last Alliance moved slowly, like figures in a dream, as if each step took them further, not only from Mordor, but from a part of themselves they had left buried in its ashes. Something irretrievable, something that had been taken not in battle, but in silence, in the long, harrowing quiet that followed the final clash of swords and the falling of kings. The soldiers did not sing. They did not speak much. Even the banners, tattered though they were, hung limp upon the windless air, and the hoofbeats of the horses seemed muffled, as though the world had pulled a veil across its ears to shut out the memories of what had been done beneath the gaze of the burning mountain. Milder rode at the head of the new Menorian column, his bearing still noble, still proud, but now heavy with a kind of pride that knows it must defend itself not against others, but against its own doubt. He wore a new cloak of deep blue and black, stitched hurriedly for the return, and beneath it, close to his breast, the ring remained. A secret no longer hidden, yet not openly declared. It hung from a simple chain, yet its presence was anything but simple. for it seemed to thrum faintly with a rhythm not quite in time with his heartbeat, like a second pulse that beat within him, or beside him, or perhaps above him, like some unseen crown. The land through which they passed had once been green, though it remembered its life only in silence now. In the broken bones of trees that stood leafless and black, their limbs stretching skyward like the hands of the fallen, pleading for the stars. Rivers once clear and silver now ran dark and sluggish through banks choked with ash. Birds did not sing here. If they remained, they watched in silence from the uppermost branches, their songs silenced by the lingering weight of evil that had not yet fully fled, only withdrawn like a tide preparing to return. Even the stars at night seemed dimmer, as though veiled by a sorrow they had no words to express. On the 6th night of their journey, they camped near the banks of the Anduin, where the river flowed slow and wide, the moon casting a long path across its surface that shimmered like a road of ghosts. The men built no fires, none were needed, for the nights were warm and the darkness not unfamiliar. Isildur stood apart from the rest, his gaze fixed upon the water, his thoughts as turbulent and tangled as the currents that moved beneath its glassy surface. It was then that Otar approached, his squire and shield-bearer, younger by many years, yet older now in ways that war had taught him, as it teaches all who endure it. He stood at a respectful distance, uncertain until Isildur spoke without turning. "Come, Otar." The river doesn't mind the sound of footsteps. The young man stepped closer, his voice hesitant but genuine. "My lord, you have not slept. Not truly. I've watched. Even when you close your eyes, your hand never leaves your chest." Isildur smiled faintly, but the smile did not touch his eyes. "The burden of kingship, Odor. We carry the realm within us, its pain, its hope, its weight." There was a long pause, filled only by the rustle of the river and the soft whisper of reeds. Utar glanced at the pendant hidden beneath Isildur's cloak, and dared a question few would have spoken aloud. "Do you trust it?" Isildur did not answer immediately. He crouched by the river's edge, scooping a handful of water and letting it run through his fingers, watching the moonlight catch on each droplet like memory fleeing the hand. "I trust nothing that speaks without voice," he said at last. "But I believe that it was given to me for a reason, that in the end, even the darkest of things may serve the light if wielded with wisdom." Oros looked troubled. "But can shadow be shaped into light, or does it only change the shape of the darkness that follows?" Isildur looked up at him, and for a moment there was no king in his eyes, only a man, tired, haunted, uncertain. "That is the question we have all been born into. Otar, even the elves, long livid and wise, do not know the answer. And perhaps there is no answer, only the choosing." They said no more, for what more could be said? The next morning dawned gray and overcast, the mist thick upon the water like breath upon a mirror. They broke camp and continued northward, and though the river ran beside them, it no longer seemed companionable. There was a hush upon the company, an unease none dared name. And then, in the vale of Gladden Fields, the silence was broken, not by word, but by arrow. The ambush came swiftly, brutally. Orcs, remnants of Sauron's scattered legions, feral and hungry for vengeance, descended from the hills with a hatred unquenched by their master's fall. They struck the column with the fury of beasts too long caged, and the men of the West, weary though they were, fought with the courage of those who know their death may mean something yet. Isildur fought like a lion cornered, his blade flashing in the mist like lightning made metal. And he called to his men to rally, to stand, to remember the fire they had survived. But it was not enough. The Orcs were too many. One by one the king's guard fell. The river ran red. At last Hisser turned to Otar and pressed into his hand the sheath containing the shards of Narsil, his voice low, urgent, fierce. "Take them, flee. The sword must be kept, even if I am not." "But there is no time," he said, his eyes wild with something between grief and fire. "Go now." And so Otar fled into the forest, heart pounding with shame and sorrow and duty. Isir, wounded but not yet fallen, turned toward the river. The ring, that small and shining lie, gleamed still at his breast. He hesitated only for a moment, and then slipped it upon his finger and vanished. But the ring had its own will and its own hunger. In the water, it betrayed him. It slipped from his finger. It called the arrows to find him. And so the last king of the last alliance fell not upon the battlefield of Mordor, but in the quiet reeds of a nameless bend in the river, unseen